All right, so what we're going to look at today are the alternate forms of a quadratic, as well as something called the zero product property. So when we started this unit, we were looking at standard form, where we had something times x squared plus c. We didn't have this middle term. This middle term is going to start being added here pretty soon, in fact today. And so we'll look at how do we do standard form and find some information. One of the things that's really good about standard form is it easily tells us our y-intercept. Because if you recall when we did intercepts, in order to find the y-intercept, we set x equal to 0. So if we were to put 0 in everywhere we see x, you'd have a times 0 squared plus b times 0 plus c. Well, anything times 0 is 0, so those all go away, and we just get y is equal to c. So in standard form, our y-intercept is going to be that c term, that constant at the end of our equation. We also looked at vertex form. Vertex form was how we did a lot of our graphing so far, where hk was our vertex, and it helped us determine that piece of information quite easily. The third kind is called intercept form. This is what we're going to start looking at today and tomorrow. And so intercept form is when it looks like a times two things being multiplied together. This is also known as factored form. So this is where I told you we were coming back to factoring. This is it. We're going back to factoring today. But we're now going to learn to not only factor, but how to factor and solve for x. And so like I said, we're going to look at the intercept part this form a lot more tomorrow. But today we are going to be working with this intercept form or factored form in the solving for x like we did with square roots yesterday. So when we solve for square roots, we were finding x-intercepts. So how do we solve for x-intercepts when it's in factored form? Well, in order to do that, we have to use this thing called the zero product property. What the zero product property tells us is that if you have two things being multiplied together and they equal 0, the product equals 0, then either A had to be 0 or B had to be 0. But one of the numbers has to be a 0 in order to get 0 as an answer to our multiplication problem. And so this is the property that we're going to use to help us solve things that are in factored form. So we're going to go through 6 examples of solving in factored form. I think it's just 6. Let me double check. Yeah, just 6. So if we look at number 1, it's already factored for us. So we're going to take the two factors that we have, and we're going to set each one equal to 0. Because the zero product property tells me that if these two things are being multiplied together and equal 0, then one of these has to equal 0. So we're going to figure out what t value makes each one 0. So here we'll subtract 1 and divide by 4. So if t is negative 1/4, this term will be 0, making the whole product 0. Over here we'll subtract 2. So if we plug in negative 2, this will become the term that's 0. So that means these here are the two x-intercepts, or the two solutions that'll give you a 0 out as your answer for y, which is another way for saying your x-intercepts. So again, when you have these, you have a product of two things, they have to equal 0. So if for some reason you have one that doesn't equal 0, that means you're going to need to get it to equal 0 before you can go any further. So again, this one's already equal to 0, so we take each thing being multiplied. So the x plus 1 is being multiplied, and the x plus 5 is the other thing being multiplied. Set each one equal to 0. And then we're going to solve for x in each equation. So subtract 1. Oops, subtract, so that's negative 1. And here we're going to subtract 5. So we have negative 1 and negative 5 as our two x-intercepts. Number 3, again, we're solving. So we want to look at what's being multiplied. Here we have 3n that's being multiplied to 2n minus 5, and it does equal 0, so we're okay there. So we're going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So here we divide both sides by 3. When 0 is on top, it's just 0. Here we'll add 5 to both sides and then divide by 2. So we'll get 5 halves. So our x-intercepts here will be at 5 halves, or if you want to write 2.5, that's okay, and 0. Okay, the next one here, we want to look at again what's being multiplied, and does it equal 0? So we have 4 times 2y minus 1 times y plus 14, and it equals 0. So this is where we go, do we have to set 4 equal to 0? So ask yourself, is there a variable here to solve for? The answer is no. If you have something outside that does not have a variable, so like this one had a letter with it, that's why we had to set up an equation. If you just have a number, you don't have to set up an equation for it. We're only going to set up equations for the things that have a variable in it. So we're only going to do the y plus 14 and the 2y minus 1. We don't need to worry about the 4 and the 0, because if we wrote it out, can 4 ever equal 0? No, so we would cross it out anyway. So we're going to solve these two. So we add 1 to both sides, divide by 2, we get 1/2. There's one x-intercept. Over here we're going to subtract 14. There's our other x-intercept. Okay, so these first 4 were given to you already factored and already set up in the right form. So then you're also going to have some though that you have to factor yourself first and then solve. So these last 2 that we're going to go through are ones where we have to factor first and then solve. When you factor first, you again want to make sure you have a 0 here. Because if you don't have a 0, this whole 0 product property falls apart. So we make it a 0, or make sure it's a 0. If it's not, we either add or subtract whatever is necessary to make it 0. So from here, I have that, so I can go ahead and start factoring. So I'm going to do my 2 parentheses, or my double bubble. 2 things that multiply to m squared are m and m. Things that multiply to negative 14. So I know one negative, one positive. So if I do negative 7 and positive 2, and I check it, I'll have negative 7m plus 2m gives me negative 5, which is what I want. Okay, so that tells me I have it factored correctly. So then I look at what are the 2 things being multiplied. M minus 7 was one of the things being multiplied, and m plus 2 is the other. Solve each one, so add 7 to both sides. Over here we'll subtract 2 to both sides, and we get negative 2 and 7. So the way that they might get a little more difficult today is the ones where you have to factor first and then go ahead and do your 0 product property to solve. Okay, so we are going to do one more with where we're going to factor ourselves before doing the 0 product property. So here we got it equal to 0, so we're okay there. There's no GCF, So I can go ahead and just start with my 2 parentheses. 3g squared, that'll be 3g times g. And then I'm looking for things that multiply to negative 14. So again, I know one negative, one positive, and I need it to add up to 1 when I test my outer product plus my inner product. So from there, if I go ahead and try 7 and 2, 2 and 7, and I make the 7 positive and the 2 negative, I'll get my 7g minus 6g to get my positive 1. So once it's factored, you set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So start by subtracting 7 divided by 3. There's one x-intercept. And over here we'll add 2. There's our second. So on your assignment, you're going to have mostly solving, but you are going to have some where you have to factor on your own, and then some that are already factored for you. So do your best. We'll go over it when I come back on the block day. Make sure if you have questions, you can also utilize the tutoring labs.